Welcome to EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for professionals advancing transportation electrification. To find out more about the show, visit atlasevhub.com/live. Climate Week NYC, one of the premier climate events of the year, is back from September 21st through the 28th, 2025. On today's episode, we'll get a preview of what to look out for this year from Angela Barranco and Richard Parker of Climate Group. We'll also dive into Climate Group's recent relaunch of its EV 100 initiative to accelerate corporate action for the EV transition. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy founder, Nick Nigro.
Hey everybody, welcome to EV Hub Live. I'm your host, Nick Nigro, and I'm very excited to be talking with two friends of mine, Angela and Ricky, about Climate Week NYC. Climate Week has a really great history and legacy here in the United States, and it's been going on since 2009, and we brought on these two great folks to talk about what we can expect this year. So let's jump right into it. Angela, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. So glad to be here.
And Ricky too, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, so Angela, first question is to you. You know, Climate Week, as I said, has been around since 2009. It's a huge event. I'm sure, in the last few years, it's been bigger than ever. What I think our audience really wants to understand is how do you prepare for an event of such magnitude, and how do you make sure that you're going to meet the moment right now? The United States is going through a lot of back and forth about what climate policy should look like, and you guys are putting on one of the most preeminent events here in the country that focuses on it. So tell us what that process looks like and what we should expect this year.
Absolutely. I would say so much has changed. At the same time, so little has changed, right? Like since 2009, it was absolutely incredible to see the enthusiasm and how excited people are to participate and be a part of this conversation. And so, what we have seen even this year is, there was a little bit of like, how do we understand this moment? A little folks sort of taking their time and trying to figure out like, who do I need to talk to? What are the, right stakeholders that I need to engage? What are the goals? How do I want to engage this year's Climate Week? But what we have seen is basically, record participation, people really from across the spectrum of climate interest. So big industrial, corporate interests, grassroots activists, international to domestic leadership, all really coming together at this time. And so I think one thing that, has been so consistent since 2009 is this interest in creating community, right? Like we all want to come together and create solutions, and we want to understand how we can do even more. And so what's been amazing is like, even with all of those changes, and even with the last changes of the last 9 months, which have been pretty wild, right? Folks are ready to go, and folks are ready to sort of stand up and get things done. So it's been very, very, I would say, lifting for me and for I think many people in the climate movement, which has been a tough few months, but at the same time, let's innovate, let's move forward, let's figure out how to kind of keep going.
Yeah, it's really heartening to hear that the community is still feeling very strong and ambitious. So one thing that folks might not know is that, this global nature of Climate Group, the fact you're the head of North America for the Climate Group, but y'all are technically based in the UK. And so you operate around the world. And one thing I think our audience really would love to understand is, how does a group like yours approach things in the United States compared to other countries? This is an EV audience, and they know that, in China, there's over 50% of new vehicle purchases are electric right now. Worldwide, we're expecting something like 25% for the year. In the US, the market is not hot, let's just say. It's certainly stagnant for the time being. So there's a different vibe around new energy technologies in the US versus elsewhere. So how do you all balance that?
I can start, and then I'd love for my colleague Ricky to jump in on this. I think as many issues, the local realities are so different, but also have many commonalities, right? Like, so, the challenges for EVs or other, types of technology in India versus China versus Latin America, which we also work in, versus the US, right? But what is so consistent, I think, across all of these is that there are leaders ready to step up in the corporate world and the subnationals who are prepared to put resources on the table, who understand the complexity is not an excuse to not act, but actually, in fact, a barrier that can be overcome through community, through collaboration. And frankly, if they're the ones to figure it out, that gives them competition, right? Like, they can compete against their, rival companies or rival countries. And so what we have found is, that leadership that is so engaged across all of those sectors not only wants to kind of work through all those issues locally, but they're very interested in that global approach. And so that's why, while we are, looking at the North America lens, we work often with our colleagues in all parts of the world, not just at Climate Week, but throughout the year. As they're figuring out problems, we're figuring them out. So there's just pure collaboration, and sometimes there's a lot of almost partnership that can be drawn from those networks as well. But I know, Ricky, you probably have a few thoughts on this too.
Yeah, definitely want to bring Ricky into this conversation, particularly on that point. Go ahead, Ricky.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, we might talk a little more in a moment about kind of the nature of our transportation work, which is primarily done through EV100, which is this coalition of corporate fleets that have committed to electrifying, and that is a global campaign. And so I kind of lead those efforts in the US. But a big part of this relaunch that we've done over the last year is to kind of take seriously the fact that the EV transition is happening globally. It is happening unevenly. It's happening at sometimes dramatically different speeds in different places. And sometimes it's happening kind of not the way we might have expected it. And so what we want to make sure is that, we think the kind of convening power that Climate Group brings, right? Climate Group convenes Climate Week. Climate Group convenes all these corporate fleets around the EV100 initiative, and that can allow us in some ways to try and steady the nature of this transition globally, so that if you see these countries that are seeing just sudden uptake in their EV adoption, we can learn from them. We can identify the enabling conditions there. We can ask that companies in those countries need to be acting quicker. And if you see a really, wealthy country like the United States that should be moving quickly, but may have different kind of sets of conditions around the EV transition, we can identify why that is and what ambition looks like in that place, and really do our best to bring corporates together to make sure that the U.S. does not become kind of an island of ICE vehicles, which I think is a concern. And I think that corporate fleets and groups like Climate Group that convene those folks have a real role to play in keeping that from happening.
Yeah, a couple of things you said jumped out at me. One being the fact that things are developing unevenly. I think a lot of people who follow the market closely are aware of that. And also, I'd love to hear, when you said some surprises along the way, I'd love to hear an example or two of that, just so that people have an understanding. But before you answer those follow-ups, just to remind the audience about what EV100 is and what do you mean by relaunching it, because I'm not sure everybody's aware of that.
Yeah, happy to dig into all that. So yeah, EV100 is one of many kind of programmatic pieces of work Climate Group does globally. So we, again, generally convene companies and subnational governments in support of kind of discrete climate action. The transportation work is done through this EV100 campaign. We have over 120 companies who have globally committed to electrifying their vehicle fleets. There's millions of vehicles through those commitments that have been committed. Over 700,000 vehicles are on the road now. Electric vehicles are on the road now through our members. So that is a campaign that was started in 2017. The EV transition looked really different in 2017. And part of that was the kind of nature of corporate commitment. Part of that was the nature of the EV transition. But a big piece of that was we didn't quite see the trends I think we see now of some countries are really pulling ahead or really acting quickly. Some aren't. Sometimes that follows kind of wealth and traditional development patterns, but sometimes it doesn't. And I think part of what we have done over the last year to kind of update this campaign, which we've done kind of through three pieces, we've kind of reworked the commitment to make it more regionally specific. We've updated some of the member offerings, and then we've made some kind of smaller tweaks to how we work across weight classes. But on that commitment piece in particular, really what we're trying to do is identify that ambition looks different in different countries and that can change rapidly, right? We worked with a consultancy based out of London to assign a weighted score to kind of every country based upon a set of enabling conditions around the EV transition that we identified. And again, a lot of those, kind of results may not surprise you. China's moving really fast. Western Europe's moving really fast. The United States was moving fast. We're kind of unsure right now, but is again a little bit lagging. But somewhere like Ethiopia is moving incredibly quickly because they have incredible nimbleness in terms of the types of policies of the vehicles that are coming into the country. And so I think we're able to take this kind of broad lens, recognize who are the countries that are doing something different, that are moving really quickly, and then again for us adjust what ambition means for a fleet in those places, right? Ambition means something different in Ethiopia than it does in the US, than it does in the UK. And what we've done through this relaunch over last year is kind of make sure the commitment reflects that reality so that you can really expect a lot of these companies. But I also think, they need to know that they can achieve the goals they're setting for themselves. And so we need a campaign that pushes them, that recognizes that we can push them differently in different places, but also make sure that they have a genuine path to success.
Yeah. So, what you described there about having sort of the adaptive nature of such an ambitious program is clearly also happening with you, Angela, in organizing Climate Week. And I just wonder if you could tell the audience a little bit about how you approached the planning for this year as opposed to years past. We have very different economic conditions this year than in 24, certainly in some of the years before that. And also now we have a very different perspective on policy, both not just in the United States, but elsewhere too. So tell us a little bit about some of the thinking that went on for you all as you huddled together and figured out what should be the priorities for this year's Climate Week, and then tell us what those are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think first and foremost, it was really important to acknowledge that things were not the same, right? But that didn't mean that everything had changed, right? And I know that's sort of a funny thing to say, but first and foremost, we have to address the reality of the policymaking in the United States, but also it's a global event. So Climate Week does not happen by accident the same week as the UN General Assembly meetings, right? So we have folks who participate from across the world. And this year, especially, we have incredible leaders from all parts of the globe participating as part of our programming to bring an update in terms of all of the work that's happening in all of these other sectors and all of these other places. So in some ways, as the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? And so part of this is to create opportunity for everybody to come together and showcase that leadership, but also not be blind, to all of the changes that have happened. And so what we've seen a lot of interest in also is closed door conversations where people can really roll up their sleeves, work through a project that they're trying to figure out, do some strategic thinking, sort of outside of the lens of just the normal, big event with lots of people and a stage and an audience, right? And I think that has been really great and interesting. So what feels is like the enthusiasm is unabated, but the energy is moving less towards, big commitments and we're having a big press conference and a big event, and more really into the work that it takes and it will take for the next few decades to really make this stick and to understand the complexities of all of these pieces, and this is not something I have to emphasize for your audience, right? I think, something as simple as EV implementation has so many components and so many different layers of government in the United States, but it is true everywhere, right? And each place is trying to figure out that puzzle. So what we were thinking as sort of the organizers of Climate Week is how do we make space for all of that, right? So not just the people who are going to come and say, we continue on, power on, right? But also all the different conversations that people are really dying to have at this moment to say, how do we keep this momentum going?
Yeah, I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, maybe give us a couple examples of some of the themes or key speakers that you have coming to the event. You mentioned what I think is very interesting is that there's a lot more emphasis on rolling up your sleeves and having implementation conversations instead of potentially lofty speeches about goals and such. So how does your agenda reflect that? And, what are some things that you want to make sure people don't miss?
Yeah, I think, well, one, just the breadth of topics, right? So we're not just talking about, let's say, EVs and building decarb and, let's say, industrial, which would be your very typical bread and butter things. We are talking about issues across the board, and even some of the issues that folks thought we're not quite ripe, like, whether it's shipping or air, other places where it's like there needs to be more here, right? And so people are rolling up their sleeves and trying to figure out those problems, both through technology and otherwise, right? I think the second thing is like this responsiveness to their interests and needs to come together in different ways. And so creating different opportunities, different layers of connectivity throughout those events, like whether it's, your happy hour. And it's funny, the happy hour plays such an important role because what it does is it gets everyone after a day of like sitting and listening to speeches or being in roundtables and thinking about stuff, you can kind of unwind a bit. But, so many people say that is so important to sort of open the mind and understand, like, okay, actually you and I can work on something together, and you have a place in the space to do that. Right. And so I think that's really, really important. And so, yeah, I think it's been a wild journey over the last few months, especially in the United States. And so we also created on Tuesday of Climate Week special programming around US leadership, which was really needed. So part of this is like, obviously everything is sort of all the different topics and issues and industries and all this stuff. And this kind of all comes together. But what we really were also like from the North America team, especially, is trying to champion the innovation that's happening today in the United States in the face of what can be seen, rightfully so, as large challenges, but that people are continuing that momentum. So we created the American Innovation and Abundance Day for the first time at the Hub Live to be able to bring those leaders together, to be able to ensure that there was not only a space for the conversation and to send the signal that, yeah, the US is still here, we're still getting things done. It may look different, but also there are new leaders who are also, all sorts of leaders from across the spectrum jumping into that and trying to figure out how to make that move forward. And so that innovation piece, I think, is a really critical part of this as well.
Ricky, I want to bring you back into the conversation because what Angela mentioned about, U.S. leadership, I'd love for you to speak to a little bit about how you see EV100 in this moment and, maybe also at Climate Week and what you expect to go on there. But in particular, what does EV100 look like from the U.S. perspective for the next year or two? Because you mentioned earlier all the uneven developments, the fact that it's a global initiative. Does it mean that you're going to be putting more resources outside the U.S. without that momentum being here right now? Or are there opportunities here for more progress in the near term?
Yeah, I think there's certainly opportunities for progress. We are not walking away from the U.S. as a priority market. We are growing globally, and part of the relaunch and the kind of nature of what we've been doing with the relaunch is to acknowledge the fact that EV100 was kind of started in Western Europe and the U.S. and is now very much global. We have teams in India, Japan, Latin America, Africa, and so this is a global commitment campaign. And we want to make sure that the nature of the campaign reflects that. But the U.S. is a priority market, and we have kind of three big thematic priorities with EV100, which is supply-side regulation, the grid, and financing. And so in the U.S., traditionally, what we meant by supply-side regulations was, federally CAFE fuel economy standards, EPA emission standards, and then at the state level, the ZEB sales mandates coming from the California Air Resources Board. Those are all right now either getting, watered down or have been somewhat eliminated. And so that's a real challenge. And what that tells us, I think, one is that the demand signal coming from these companies still really matters, right? That if nothing else, what we have is companies committing to buy these vehicles so that manufacturers, if they do not have a regulatory reason to invest in their manufacturing capacity, have a market reason because there are buyers out there willing to spend a lot of money to buy a lot of vehicles. And so that's really important. And I think fleets as just major buyers of vehicles is a really important, again, we want to be a lot more than that. We want to be, impacting policy, looking at kind of global enabling conditions, but kind of first and foremost, this is aggregated demand. And that remains, I think, a critical tool. If supply side regulations, especially coming from the federal government, are not going to be a big tool for the EV transition over the next couple of years, we're going to look elsewhere, right? The grid, a lot of cases, the grid is handled at the state level, right? When you talk about financing, we're looking at these vehicles, especially heavy duty vehicles. There's, I think, a lot of questions to be worked out around how, what is the role of fleets and working with financial institutions to make purchasing of, especially again, heavy duty electric vehicles work. I think that's a big question. And if we are going to spend less time in the coming years looking at, making advanced clean trucks adopted more broadly, which had kind of been our existing priority, we now live in a world where that is not the case. are unhappy about that. But we're going to move forward, and we can say, hey, there's big financing questions that we think we can convene and answer. There's big questions about the grid that we think we can convene and answer. So you, as Angela's kind of been saying, if it's not one thing, it's something else, right? And what we believe is that we are working with a set of companies and a set of partners that are committed to this transition, that see this transition as a decades-long thing. And so kind of individual sets of federal policies are not going to change that. The other thing I'd say is that, we are about kind of sharing knowledge within the network. And so if Europe's moving faster in the US, if there's other, China's moving faster in the US, again, if there's other countries kind of maybe unexpectedly in other regions that are moving faster in the US, that is also lessons that can be brought here and it can be shared among these corporate fleets to understand kind of what are the actual practical tools to get these vehicles on the road.
So similar question to you, Angela, just more broadly on the Climate Week strategy agenda and what folks can expect there. Where do you see opportunities in the near term? In what are you hearing from your companies aside from some of the maybe you could be specific about some of the policy areas or technologies that are getting particular attention right now in the U.S.?
I think we're definitely. It's an interesting time, right? Because there are so many challenges, say, from the federal level, but what we are hearing at the state and the local level is that there is so much opportunity from both an economic development. So, from a clean energy deployment side, they're like, hey, we're moving forward because this is going to help our ratepayer base, right? From the EV side, we're hearing like, okay, yeah, I mean, this might be a little challenging, but our consumers are still buying these cars and our citizens are still interested in this charging, infrastructure. And we're building new buildings and we're going to put them in there because this is now a part of the culture, right? And so it's kind of interesting. I think even things like building decarb are really very interesting because, again, also maybe some of the economic swirl that's been happening is people are looking for savings and consumer value, right? And so I think what has been very interesting to see is also the feedback that a lot of these steps, especially from the corporate side, but also from the state and local side, it's about consumer savings. It's about, hey, or consumer preference. It's not, and in some ways climate neutral. I'm not, that's a nice to have, but people are really like, what? People want to save money right now. So we're going to help, with this building retrofit, or that's going to continue at the local level with a rebate because it's really important to our constituency. And so I don't know. I think this is an interesting time where maybe we've accelerated a lot of these technologies to a point where adoption is going to be, kind of neutral to the sort of policy goal that was originating, and it's going to fall into a consumer preference box. So I think that's one of the more interesting things we're hearing.
Yeah, I have to just echo that a little bit from where I sit. Affordability is clearly a top issue, and inflation was a key driver in what made voters decide what they wanted in the last election here in the U.S. And electricity prices are rising above inflation for the last couple of years, so we have a lot of pressures on affordability just more generally. But you also mentioned the fact that the technology that our climate solutions can often be the most affordable. So I wonder if this goes to either one of you now, as you could talk about that transition in terms of the climate, either the advocacy community or the corporate community. How are they changing and evolving to focus more on the savings and sort of the technology economic benefits of these solutions, as opposed to kind of wearing their green armband or being pro environment? How are they changing their tune, if you will, in this moment?
I'll start, but I think you're kind of hitting the nail on the head a little bit, which is like the 10 to 20 to 30 year sustainability plan is still moving forward, but maybe it's now called some, corporate efficiency or consumer preference plan. So the language has changed in some courts, and in others it hasn't. It's just, I think it's an acknowledgement of the economic drivers that are really underneath a lot of the sort of trends that we see in consumers. And it's less about sort of virtue signaling and, I believe in climate, and I think people do believe in climate, but they are concerned about bread and butter issues every single day. Can I afford my rent? Can I pay my electric bill? Can I, save money to be able to do any number of life-changing things in the future, right? And so, perhaps in some ways it's actually a good acknowledgement, a good kind of reset for us in the climate policy community to sort of be reminded that affordability question, that consumer preference question is really at the heart of the transition. Not so much the policy, the ideals and leadership, and certainly the science and all these things are very important, but the future that we're envisioning that has all of this technology deeply embedded throughout society, that requires a consumer to agree, and so I don't know, maybe in some ways it's actually good for us to be looking at that much more closely, much quickly, but I'm sure Ricky has some ideas on the EV side.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's funny. One of the things it makes me think of is we're working with these companies, and sometimes you see these companies have smaller sustainability teams than they used to, and sometimes that's a bad sign, but sometimes that's a good sign because that's not a niche thing in the company now. Now they just have a fleet team, right? And so they don't have 4 people who are experts on transportation electrification. You have your fleet team, and their job is to electrify the fleet. And I think then cost becomes really important because then they're making fairly practical decisions. And I think, again, that's in some ways truer as you get to like heavier vehicles. And so if you're looking at like class 6, class 7, class 8 trucks, price is really important. And price is important because we want the emissions to come down. The price is important because the cost of a truck determines the cost of all goods in the economy, right? And so I think we are really starting to see this alignment between the cost of the technologies that kind of we in the climate space are really passionate about is also just kind of the costs in the real world that people experience. And we need all of those to come down. And that's in some ways one fight, not these kind of niche issues.
Yeah, so that's a really great segue to the last question I had for you all. And it's building off what you were saying there, both of you, because one word that I try to use a lot nowadays is practitioner, because there's a lot of folks in the outside looking in in the world that we operate in, telling us that we should be moving faster, or telling us that all we have to do is X, Y, Z and everything would be done. But they're not the ones who are tasked with executing, Ricky, like the fleet folks that you just described. So tell me about the audience for Climate Week and how that has evolved from, perhaps those higher level folks who are talking about an ambitious future that they can believe in, and evolving to, the folks who actually have to roll up their sleeves, like you said, Angela, and get the job done. Tell us who you want at Climate Week that you might not be having today, or who is going to be at Climate Week that folks might not be expecting in that regard. Let's start with you, Angela, and then we'll go over to you, Ricky.
Gosh, the thing with Climate Week is that you would be surprised. You get every part of that really represented. Except what I would say, and this is actually like where I would jump in and, so we definitely have the in corporate practitioner, like having technical conversations. There's a whole calendar of other types of technical convenings, but Climate Week they come to, they're really participatory. That executive level is very participatory too. Certainly in the technology fields of all stripes, like, folks are showing up and they're talking about their new products, they're creating new markets, investment and capital is in the room too. Like all of that is great. But what I have noticed is that I would almost say like ancillary movements have been slow to adopt Climate Week, but that's changing, so even this year I'm saying, so what I'll say, like public health professionals, those are really needed for a lot of the work that we do on the regulatory side, but also just as validators in terms of things like reduction of air pollution and the benefits of EVs, right? Like all of these sort of things. And so folks in the public health community have not traditionally seen, Climate Week as theirs, right? And but we're starting to see that they're kind of showing up too and saying, actually, this is a part of the world that I work in, and I do want to be connected with all of sort of those other experts that are at the table. I think the same goes for like traditional economists and folks who are kind of more in the space of like jobs and economy and labor and all this sort of stuff. I think they're coming to see this as well. And so, those are just two that I would name that are, I think, really critical to the work that we do, that the more we can bring them in, the stronger our arguments, but also the stronger the coalitions and that we're making that are going to be needed to make that change.
Ricky, I'll just give you some space to expand on what you were talking about earlier about the evolution of EV100. Who was at the table in the early days? Who's at the table now? Who do you expect to be at the table a couple of years from now? That sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I do. It is. We love the people who come to Climate Week and are great on panels. We love those people. But it has been interesting. Like, you do see the evolution among, like, all right, maybe it's not that person. Maybe it is the person who's really, like, making the orders of how many of these vehicles. And, you know, does this certain electric van have the payload capacity we need? And we're having that version of conversation much more than what's the biggest number we can just commit to and figure it out in 5 years, right? And I think that's a good evolution, even if it's at times disappointing. I think the thing that comes to mind, and this is because this is kind of always on my mind these days, is, you know, who's not there, who I really hope we're able to get into these spaces is, you know, smaller businesses, especially in the trucking space, right? As I'm sure you know, Nick, as I'm sure a lot of your audience knows, like, a lot of the trucks that are on the road, the big trucks, are owned by very, very small fleets. And we've not been able to get those folks there. And so we get the people they contract with there, we get their customers there maybe, but that's a critical tool of the kind of transportation decarbonization effort. And I think the more that we are able to kind of bring those folks to the table, which I think we're getting closer to as we kind of fill out that ecosystem, I really hope that if we have this conversation in a couple of years, that, like, those folks are at the table, because I think that's a critical one that again, I think we're getting closer, but the job's certainly not done.
A great flag, Ricky. I have to agree that you know, when you try to align all these voices together to make decisions, it's important you have the user at the end of the day there too. And in the case of trucks, it's often an individual, a sole proprietor, or a very, very small business, and it's hard to reach them. So, you know, I wish you a lot of luck, but I think it's essential that you succeed. So, yeah, with that, I just want to thank Angela and Ricky from the Climate Group. I wish you both the best at Climate Week New York City, going on the 16th year, or this year? Is that right?
Yes, 16th.
Yeah. But yeah, since 2009,
Yes.
wonderful legacy there, and really excited to hear how it goes. And thanks again for coming on EV Hub Live.
Thank you so much. Great to see you.